My name is Claire Miller and I'm 32 years old. 5 years ago, my sister told my parents I was stealing their money for drugs. She lied, and that single lie destroyed my entire family. They threw me out. They blocked my calls. They returned my letters unopened. For 5 years, I was nobody's daughter. Then last week, my sister Samantha was rushed into my trauma bay, bleeding and unconscious from a car accident. The trauma team called for the chief of surgery. When the doors opened and my father saw the name, Drive. C. Miller, on my white coat, he didn't recognize the homeless, drug addict they'd abandoned was now trying to save his favorite daughter's life. "How dare you wear that name?" he screamed across the waiting room, his face purple with rage. "You're a fraud. A homeless drug addict who stole some doctor's identity." The residents stared. The nurses whispered. 5 years of building respect, destroyed in 30 seconds. But what my parents didn't know was that while they were throwing me away, Samantha had been systematically stealing $63,000 from their Medicare accounts, using me as the perfect scapegoat. Before we dive into this story, please hit subscribe, but only if you're genuinely invested in hearing how this unfolds. Drop your location in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're listening from right now. Now let me take you back to that cold March morning in Connecticut, to the moment I realized that sometimes the person bleeding on your table is the same person who's been bleeding you dry for years. The fluorescent lights in the trauma bay hummed with their familiar frequency, casting everything in that harsh, unforgiving white that made even healthy people look half dead. Claire Miller stood at the industrial sink, scrubbing her hands with the methodical precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The water ran scalding hot, turning her skin an angry red, but she kept scrubbing. Raw knuckles, raw everything. At 32, Claire had perfected the art of washing away more than just bacteria. Each morning ritual in this sterile cathedral was the same: arrive at 5:30, black coffee from the machine that tasted like burnt cardboard, check the surgery schedule, and scrub until her hands were clean enough to hold someone's life. The chief of trauma surgery at Mercierest Medical Center didn't have the luxury of dirty hands or cluttered thoughts. She reached for the paper towels, her movements sharp and economical. Through the break room window, Connecticut's March sky hung gray and heavy, promising the kind of late winter that made everyone mean and tired. The smell of industrial bleach mixed with the lingering aroma of someone's leftover Chinese takeout from the night shift. On the break room table, a stack of mail sat abandoned by the day shift supervisor. Bills, medical supply catalogs, and they're like a ghost materializing in broad daylight: a Medicare Part D notice with familiar handwriting. Robert Miller, 1247 Elm Street, Hartford. Her father's address. Her old address. The address she hadn't spoken aloud in exactly 1,825 days. Claire's latex gloves snapped against her wrists with the sharp crack of a judge's gavel. Her Apple Watch buzzed against her skin. No caller ID. The same phantom number that had been trying to reach her for 5 years. She let it go to voicemail, just like always. The thing about trauma surgery was that it taught you to compartmentalize. Bleeding patient on table 3, family crisis in the hallway, insurance paperwork. Denying coverage for life-saving procedures. You learned to put each crisis in its own little box and deal with them one at a time. Claire had gotten so good at compartmentalizing that sometimes she forgot which box held her own heart. She walked down the corridor toward the OR, her scrubs still smelling faintly of fabric softener and the lavender detergent her husband Nathaniel insisted on using. The sound of her footsteps echoed against the polished linoleum, a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her new life. In this building, surrounded by these people who called her Chief and Dr. Miller, with genuine respect, she was exactly who she had fought to become. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from an unknown number. "Claire, it's important. Please call." The area code was Hartford. The area code of her childhood, her parents, her sister Samantha, the entire world she had surgically removed from her life like a malignant tumor. Claire deleted the message without reading it twice. In her pocket, she fingered the yellowed sticky note she'd been carrying for 5 years, the edges soft and worn from handling. Sarah's handwriting, faded but still legible: "Don't let your blood tell you who you are." The last gift from the last person who had ever truly known her. The trauma bay doors swung open ahead of her, and Claire stepped through them like she did every morning, leaving everything else behind, carrying only the skills that had saved hundreds of lives and the cold determination that had saved her own. She reached for her pill organizer, the 7-day container that kept her anxiety medication, vitamins, and the small white pills that helped her sleep without dreaming about families that throw their children away. The plastic compartments clicked open and shut with tiny, precise sounds. Monday through Sunday, color-coded and controlled. Everything in its place, everything serving its purpose. The intercom crackled overhead, Trauma 1, incoming. ETA 3 minutes. Claire's hands were clean. Her mind was clear. Her past was buried so deep that sometimes she could almost believe it had happened to someone else entirely. Almost. But as she walked toward the trauma bay, the Medicare notice seemed to burn in her peripheral vision, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that clean hands didn't always mean clean conscience. Some stains went deeper than skin, deeper than soap and scalding water could reach. The ambulance sirens were getting closer now, their wailing cry cutting through the Connecticut morning like a scream from another lifetime. Claire checked her watch. 7:45 a.m. In her old life, this was when her mother would be making coffee in the yellow kitchen on Elm Street, when her father would be reading the Hartford Courant with reading glasses sliding down his nose, when Samantha would be getting ready for whatever job she was pretending to have that week. But this wasn't her old life. This was the life she had built with her own bloody hands, one surgery at a time, one day at a time, one carefully controlled breath at a time. And she'd be damned if she was going to let some Medicare notice and a few phantom phone calls tear down what had taken her 5 years to build. The ambulance doors were about to open. Someone's life was about to be placed in her hands. And Claire Miller, chief of trauma surgery, was ready. She just wished Claire Miller, the girl who used to live on Elm Street, would finally stop trying to claw her way back to the surface. The ambulance bay doors exploded open with a metallic crash that reverberated through the trauma unit like a gunshot. The March wind swept in, carrying the scent of exhaust fumes and something metallic and wrong that made Claire's stomach clench before her mind could process why. Female, 35, multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping fast, the paramedic shouted as they wheeled the gurney through the automatic doors. Claire stepped forward, her training taking over like a well-rehearsed dance. She grabbed the iPad from the intake desk, her eyes scanning the patient information that appeared on the screen. Name Samantha Miller. Age 35. Emergency contact Robert Miller. Insurance Medicare secondary, primary through. The iPad slipped from Claire's hands, clattering against the floor tiles with a sound like breaking glass. Samantha Miller lay on the gurney, her face pale as hospital sheets. Her honey blonde hair matted with blood that looked almost black under the fluorescent lights. The same hair that used to catch sunlight in the backyard of their childhood home. The same face that had smiled at Claire from 1,000 family photos before those photos were taken down and put away. "Chief, we need to move, drive," Rodriguez said, appearing at Claire's elbow. But Claire couldn't move. She could only stare at the woman on the gurney, the woman who had destroyed her life with surgical precision, now lying there, bleeding and broken and trusting Claire to save her. The trauma bay doors opened again, and Robert Miller stumbled in behind the gurney. 62 years old now, his hair completely gray, wearing a Hartford Community College windbreaker that had seen better decades. He clutched a Social Security statement in one hand and car keys in the other, his eyes wild with the kind of panic that comes from watching your child bleed. He looked directly at Claire, his gaze passing over her like she was just another piece of medical equipment. No recognition, no flicker of awareness. To him, she was simply, Chief, the person in charge, the one who might be able to save his favorite daughter. "Please," he said, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Please, she's all we have." Behind him, Eleanor Miller appeared in the doorway, clutching a Medicare card holder against her chest like a shield. She was smaller than Claire remembered, more fragile, her hands shaking as she held what looked like an EOB, an explanation of benefits form that had been altered, the original numbers crossed out and rewritten in Samantha's distinctive handwriting. Claire's hands moved without conscious thought, pulling on fresh gloves, checking Samantha's vital signs, ordering blood work and a CT scan. Her voice was steady and professional as she called out medical instructions, but inside, her mind was screaming. This was the woman who had told their parents that Claire was stealing money for drugs. This was the woman who had convinced them that their youngest daughter was a lost cause, a family embarrassment better forgotten. "Get me 2 units of O negative, stat," Claire called out, her voice cutting through the chaos of the trauma bay. "And I want a full toxicology screen." Dr. Rodriguez gave her a sharp look. Tox screens weren't standard for trauma cases unless there was cause for suspicion. But Claire's expression brooked no argument. As the medical team worked around Samantha's gurney, Claire caught fragments of conversation from her parents in the hallway. Eleanor's voice, high and thin with worry, "The insurance won't cover everything, will it? Samantha handles all our finances now, ever since." "Since what?" a social worker was asking. "Since our other daughter got involved with drugs," Robert said, his voice heavy with shame. "We don't talk about her anymore. Samantha's been taking care of us, handling the Medicare paperwork, making sure we're okay." Claire's hands tightened around the stethoscope she was holding. Every word was a fresh cut, each casual dismissal of her existence another small death. But what made it worse was the way Eleanor kept glancing at that altered EOB form. The way Robert's Social Security statement seemed to have mysterious deductions marked in different ink. Through the glass partition, Claire watched Eleanor try to hide the Medicare card holder when Dr. Martinez asked about insurance information. The woman who had taught Claire to ride a bicycle and bake chocolate chip cookies was now fumbling with paperwork that looked like it had been doctored, numbers and dates that didn't quite line up. "Chief Miller?" Dr. Rodriguez was looking at her with concern. "The patient's stabilizing. Do you want to speak with the family?" Claire looked through the glass at the 2 people who had given her life and then taken it away again. Robert was pacing now, his Hartford Community College windbreaker zipped up to his throat despite the warmth of the hospital. Eleanor sat in a plastic chair, still clutching that Medicare holder, her eyes fixed on nothing. They had no idea who she was. 5 years had changed her enough. Different haircut, the confidence that came with surgical training, the way she carried herself now like someone who mattered. To them, she was just another doctor, just another stranger in scrubs who might or might not be able to save the daughter they loved. "No," Claire said quietly. "Let drive. Martinez handle the family." She turned back to Samantha, who was beginning to stir under the influence of the pain medication. For a moment, their eyes met, sister to sister, victim to perpetrator, doctor to patient. Samantha's lips moved, forming words that only Claire could hear. "I know who you are." Claire's blood turned to ice water in her veins. But her hands remained steady as she checked Samantha's IV, her voice calm and professional as she dictated notes for the medical record. Whatever game Samantha thought she was playing, whatever manipulation she was planning, Claire held all the cards now. She was the one with the medical license. She was the one with the power to save or lose Samantha's life. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough. But as she walked away from the trauma bay, leaving Samantha in the capable hands of her medical team, Claire couldn't shake the image of Eleanor's trembling hands and that altered insurance form. Her parents weren't just cruel, they were victims too. Victims of the same woman Claire had just saved. The irony was so sharp it cut. The waiting room of Mercierest Medical Center had the unique ability to strip away every pretense of human dignity. Under fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects, plastic chairs arranged in military straight rows held the walking wounded of everyday life, worried parents, exhausted spouses, anyone who had ever loved someone enough to wait. Claire stepped into this purgatory wearing her white coat like armor, her stethoscope draped around her neck like a badge of authority. She had changed into fresh scrubs after Samantha's surgery. But she could still smell the metallic scent of blood under her nails, still feel the weight of holding someone's life in her hands. Robert Miller sat in the corner, his Hartford Community College windbreaker unzipped. Now, revealing a plaid shirt that had been ironed with the careful precision of a man who still dressed like he had somewhere important to be. His Social Security statement lay folded on the chair beside him, creased from nervous handling. When he saw Claire approaching, he stood up. Not with gratitude, not with the relief of a father whose daughter had just been saved, but with the same rigid pride that had always been his trademark. The same pride that had led him to choose appearances over truth, that had made him capable of throwing away a daughter to protect a family image. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge here." Claire stopped 3 feet away, her hands clasped behind her back in the position she'd learned during medical school presentations. Professional distance. Clinical objectivity. "I'm Chief Miller. I performed your daughter's surgery." Robert's eyes swept over her name tag, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, followed immediately by something darker. Anger. Disgust. The same look he'd given her that last day on Elm Street, when Samantha's lies had finally convinced him that his youngest daughter was beyond redemption. "How dare you," he said, his voice rising enough to draw stares from other families in the waiting room. "How dare you wear that name?" Eleanor looked up from her Medicare card holder, her face pale and drawn. She recognized Claire now too, the sharp realization spreading across her features like spilled water. But instead of speaking, she turned away, as if the act of not seeing could make the truth disappear. "I don't know how you got this job," Robert continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "I don't know what lies you told or what credentials you stole, but I'm calling security. You're a fraud. You're a homeless drug addict who probably stole some real doctor's identity." Dr. Rodriguez and 2 residents had materialized in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Claire could see their faces: concern, confusion, the beginnings of doubt. This was how reputations were destroyed, she realized. Not through malpractice or incompetence, but through the toxic spillover of family poison. "Sir, drive," Rodriguez said, stepping forward. "I can assure you that Dr. Miller is." "Don't you dare defend her," Robert snapped. "We threw her out of our house 5 years ago for stealing money for drugs. She was living in her car the last time we saw her. And now she's wearing a doctor's coat? It's impossible." The waiting room had gone completely quiet now, every conversation stopped, every eye focused on the drama unfolding in front of them. Claire could feel their stares like physical weights, could see the doubt creeping into the faces of her colleagues. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, "Robert, please." "Not here." But Robert wasn't finished. His face had turned a dangerous shade of purple, the color of a man whose blood pressure was climbing toward stroke territory. "She destroyed our family. She stole from us, lied to us, disappeared for years, and now she's pretending to be someone she's not. My real daughter is lying in there fighting for her life, and this person is playing dress up." Claire spotted the power of attorney document peeking out of Robert's coat. Pocket legal papers that gave someone else control over his finances, his medical decisions, his life. The edges were worn, suggesting frequent use, and she caught a glimpse of Samantha's signature in the corner. "Your real daughter," Claire said quietly, "is the one who's been handling your Medicare paperwork, isn't she? The one who takes care of your Social Security deposits." Something flickered across Robert's face: confusion, then defensive anger. "Samantha takes care of us. She's responsible. She's been stealing from you," Claire said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment she used to deliver terminal diagnoses. "Those Medicare forms your wife is holding? The ones with the crossed-out numbers? The Social Security statement with deductions that don't match the official records? Your responsible daughter has been draining your accounts to pay her own debts." Eleanor's Medicare card holder slipped from her hands, spilling forms across the waiting room floor. Robert stared at Claire with the expression of a man whose entire worldview was crumbling in real time. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "Samantha wouldn't. She's taking care of us." Claire knelt down and gathered the scattered papers, her trained eyes quickly scanning the altered numbers. The forged signatures, the systematic evidence of financial abuse. She handed them back to Eleanor, whose hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold them. "Look at the dates," Claire said gently. "Look at the account numbers. Then ask yourself, when was the last time you actually saw your bank statements?" Robert's face had gone from purple to gray, the color of a man realizing that the daughter he'd chosen had been systematically destroying him, while the daughter he'd rejected had just saved his life. The irony was so complete it was almost artistic. "Samantha will recover fully," Claire said, standing up and smoothing her white coat. "Her injuries were serious but not life-threatening. The surgery was successful. She turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Miller? I've been chief of trauma surgery here for 2 years. My medical license is legitimate, my credentials are real, and my success rate is 96%. But you're right about one thing, I was homeless for a while. Turns out being disowned by your family for crimes you didn't commit has a tendency to complicate your housing situation." As she walked toward the elevator, Claire could hear Eleanor crying behind her, soft, broken sounds that might have been for the daughter who had betrayed them or the daughter they had thrown away. Robert was silent, staring at the Medicare forms in his hands like they were written in a foreign language. The elevator doors opened, and Claire stepped inside, leaving her parents to confront the truth they had spent 5 years avoiding. Some wounds, she had learned, could only heal after the infection was drained. And some families could only be saved by being torn apart first. The doors closed with a soft chime, carrying her away from the wreckage of her old life and back to the clean, controlled world of surgery suites and medical charts. But for the first time in 5 years, Claire Miller felt like she might finally be ready to stop running. 4 o'clock in the morning was the loneliest hour in any hospital. When the day shift had gone home and the night shift moved through the corridors like ghosts. Claire sat alone in her office, surrounded by the detritus of a life built on professional achievement and personal exile, medical journals stacked in precise towers, awards hanging on walls like evidence of her worth, and a coffee cup that had grown cold hours ago. The returned letter lay on her desk like an accusation. She'd been staring at it for 20 minutes, this envelope that bore her parents' address in her own handwriting, stamped with "Return to Sender" in Eleanor's distinctive script. It was the third letter she'd sent in 5 years, Christmas cards, really brief notes that said nothing and everything. "Hope you're well. I'm doing okay. Still thinking of you," all returned unopened. Her laptop screen glowed with the financial audit. Martha had sent spreadsheets that told a story more devastating than any soap opera. Column after column of Robert's Social Security deposits, each one showing systematic withdrawals that didn't match any legitimate expense. Medicare reimbursements redirected to accounts that belonged to Samantha. Bank transfers that happened on the same days Robert would have been taking his afternoon naps, trusting his responsible daughter to handle the complicated business of modern life. The numbers didn't lie. Over 5 years, Samantha had stolen nearly $60,000 from their parents' money meant for prescriptions, utilities, the small comforts that made elderly life bearable. She had been bleeding them dry while convincing them that their other daughter was the thief. Claire's hands shook as she scrolled through the evidence. Every fraudulent transaction was dated, documented, irrefutable. While she had been living in a studio apartment in Portland, eating ramen noodles and working 3 jobs to pay for medical school applications, Samantha had been systematically destroying the people who trusted her most. The pill organizer sat on the corner of her desk, not the one she used now, but the old one. The one she'd bought for her parents during her first year of medical school, back when she still believed family meant something. 7 compartments, color-coded, with little symbols for morning and evening doses. She'd spent $40 on it, money she couldn't afford, because she wanted to help them manage their medications properly. They'd never used it. It had sat in the trunk of her car for 5 years, moving from apartment to apartment like a talisman of rejected love. Claire picked up the pill organizer now, feeling its weight. Remembering the hopeful girl who had thought a $40 gift might bridge the gap between who she was and who her family wanted her to be. The plastic felt cheap in her hands, the hinges loose from age and neglect. She threw it against the office wall. The sound was satisfying, 7 compartments exploding, plastic shards scattering across the floor like the fragments of her old life. Monday through Sunday, scattered and broken, just like the family that was supposed to fit neatly into those compartments. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't just been saving Samantha's life in that trauma bay. She had been saving the life of the woman who had spent 5 years systematically destroying everything Claire had ever loved. The woman who had convinced their parents that their youngest daughter was a drug-addicted thief while she was actually the one stealing from them. The hospital was quiet around her, but Claire could hear everything: the whisper of central air, the distant beeping of monitors, the soft footsteps of nurses making rounds. These were the sounds of her new life, the life she had built from nothing after losing everything. These people respected her, trusted her, called her chief, and meant it. But sitting in this office at 4 in the morning, surrounded by the evidence of her sister's betrayal and her parents' willing blindness, Claire felt the weight of 5 years of isolation crushing down on her like water. She had saved hundreds of lives in this building, had earned the respect of her colleagues, had built something meaningful from the ashes of her old existence. And none of it mattered because the people who were supposed to love her most had chosen to believe the worst about her without question. The silent scream that escaped her throat was the sound of a woman finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had been done to her. Not the anger she'd been carrying that for years. Not the disappointment that had calcified into acceptance long ago. This was grief. Pure, uncomplicated grief for the family she'd lost. And the girl she'd been before she learned that blood meant nothing and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She put her head in her hands and let herself cry for the first time since that rainy night in Hartford. When she'd driven away from Elm Street with nothing but a suitcase and the knowledge that sometimes loving people means accepting that they'll never love you back. The audit report glowed on her laptop screen. 47 pages of evidence that could destroy Samantha's life just as thoroughly as Samantha had destroyed hers. Claire stared at those numbers through her tears and realized that for the first time in 5 years, she held all the cards. It wasn't the lie that had broken her heart. It was the realization that her parents preferred the lie to her. They had chosen Samantha's version of reality because it was easier than admitting they might have been wrong about their youngest daughter. But lies had a way of catching up with people. And sometimes, if you were patient enough and strong enough, and lucky enough, you got to be the one holding the scalpel when the truth finally needed to be cut out. Claire wiped her eyes and reached for her phone. It was time to make some calls. Memory was a strange surgeon. It could cut away years of careful healing with a single, precise incision. Claire sat in her darkened office, the financial audit still glowing on her laptop screen, and let herself remember the last time she'd felt this powerless. Portland, Oregon. 3 years ago. The studio apartment on Morrison Street that smelled like other people's cooking and her own quiet desperation. She'd been working 3 jobs, then medical transcription during the day, inventory at a pharmacy overnight, and weekend shifts at a physical therapy clinic. 18-hour days that blurred together into one long marathon of exhaustion and determination. Sarah Chen had been her only friend, a nursing student who lived in the apartment above her and had the kind of faith in people that made her dangerous to know. Sarah with her thermos of green tea and her collection of motivational quotes taped to every surface of her tiny kitchen. Sarah who had believed Claire's story when no one else would. "You're going to be a doctor," Sarah would say, usually while heating up instant noodles on her hot plate. "I can see it in the way you move, the way you think. You have surgeon's hands." Claire had laughed at that, looking down at her hands raw from washing dishes, scarred from a dozen minimum wage jobs. Shaking from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. "These don't look like surgeon's hands." "Not yet," Sarah had said. "But they will." The last conversation they'd had was burned into Claire's memory with the clarity that comes from trauma. Sarah lying in the hospital bed at OHSU, her face yellow from liver failure. Her body finally succumbing to the hepatitis C she'd contracted from a contaminated needle in nursing school. Claire had been holding her hand when Sarah pressed something into her palm, a yellow sticky note with writing that looked like it had been done by a child. "Don't let your blood tell you who you are," it said in Sarah's careful printing. "What does that mean?" Claire had asked, but Sarah was already drifting off, the morphine carrying her away from pain and toward whatever came after. She'd died 3 hours later. 26 years old, full of dreams about healing people, destroyed by a single moment of carelessness with a dirty needle. The memorial service had been held in a chapel that smelled like old flowers and broken promises. Attended by a dozen nursing students who cried prettily and went home to their families. Claire had been the only one there who had nowhere to go afterward. The yellow sticky note was still in her badge holder now, 5 years later, its edges soft from handling. She'd carried it through medical school interviews, through residency rotations, through the first surgery she'd ever performed as attending physician. Sarah's words had become her mantra, her armor against the voices in her head that sounded suspiciously like her father's disappointment and her mother's shame. But sitting in her office now, surrounded by evidence of Samantha's systematic betrayal, Claire remembered something else from that Portland apartment. Something she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it hadn't happened. The phone call. It had been a Tuesday evening in November, rain drumming against her windows like accusations. Sarah was already sick then, already spending more time in bed than on her feet. And Claire was working her way through a stack of medical transcription files when her phone had rung. Samantha's voice, sweet and concerned. "Claire? Oh, thank God you answered. I've been so worried about you." The shock had been physical, like touching a live wire. 5 years of silence, and suddenly her sister was on the phone, sounding like she actually cared. "I know Mom and Dad have been hard on you," Samantha had continued, "but I've been thinking. Maybe it's time for you to come home. Maybe we can work things out." Hope had unfurled in Claire's chest like a flower she'd thought was dead. For 10 minutes, she'd let herself imagine it, walking back into the house on Elm Street, hugging her parents, starting over. Until she'd heard the papers rustling in the background. "Sam," Claire had said carefully, "what are you doing right now?" A pause. Then, "Just paying some bills for Mom and Dad. You know how they are with paperwork." "What kind of bills?" "Medicare stuff. It's so complicated, Claire. They really need someone to help them navigate all this bureaucracy." The sound of a pen scratching against paper. The soft murmur of Samantha reading numbers under her breath. And suddenly, Claire had understood. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about covering tracks. Samantha hadn't called because she missed her sister, she'd called because she needed to know if Claire was paying attention to their parents' finances. "I have to go," Claire had said. "Wait, Claire, don't you want to?" She'd hung up, blocked the number, spent the rest of the night sitting on her bathroom floor, crying for the sister she'd thought she might still have and the family that had apparently died long before she'd realized it. Now, staring at the financial records on her laptop screen, Claire could see what Samantha had been doing during that phone call. November 15, 2022, a Medicare reimbursement check endorsed and deposited into Samantha's personal account. While she'd been talking to Claire about coming home, she'd been literally stealing from their parents. The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful. Samantha had been using her as an alibi, counting on her silence and absence to continue her systematic theft. She'd known that Claire would never contact their parents directly, would never expose the financial irregularities, would never do anything that might force a confrontation with the family that had already discarded her once. She'd been right, too. For 3 years, Claire had carried the weight of that knowledge alone, afraid that speaking up would only confirm their worst opinions about her. The drug-addicted daughter trying to cause trouble from a distance. The family disappointment attempting to destroy the responsible one out of jealousy. But Sarah's words echoed in the quiet office, "Don't let your blood tell you who you are." Blood was supposed to be thicker than water, but Claire had learned that sometimes blood was just another word for poison. Sometimes the family you were born into was just the first mistake you had to learn to survive. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. The Hartford Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. She'd looked it up 6 months ago, during a moment of weakness when she'd almost convinced herself to act on what she knew. This time, she wasn't going to let weakness stop her. This time, she was going to let the truth do the surgery. The ICU at Mercierest was designed for quiet dramas, the kind of life and death struggles that played out in whispered conversations and steady beeping monitors. Claire's footsteps echoed against the polished linoleum as she made her way down the corridor, past rooms filled with people whose bodies were fighting battles their minds couldn't control. Samantha's room was at the end of the hall, behind a door marked with warning signs about infection control and visitor restrictions. Through the glass panel, Claire could see her sister lying in the adjustable bed, connected to machines that measured her vital signs with digital precision. Samantha looked smaller than she had in the trauma bay, diminished by the white hospital gown and the IVs snaking into her arms. Claire paused outside the door, holding the manila folder that contained 5 years of financial records, bank statements, and Medicare fraud documentation. In her other hand, she carried a Social Security statement that showed exactly how much money Samantha had stolen, $63,847.52, to be precise. Enough to pay for a year of medical school, or a down payment on a house. Or simply enough to live with dignity in your old age without worrying about prescription costs. The door opened with a soft hydraulic whisper. Samantha's eyes were closed, her breathing slow and regular under the influence of post-surgical pain medication. But Claire knew she wasn't really sleeping. There was something too alert about the way she held her shoulders, too controlled about the rhythm of her breathing. "I know you're awake," Claire said, pulling up the bedside chair and sitting down with the deliberate calm of someone who had all the time in the world. Samantha's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Claire with an expression that managed to be both calculating and vulnerable. 5 years older than her sister, Samantha had always been the pretty one, the charming one. The one who could talk her way out of trouble and into other people's good graces. Even now, pale and injured, she radiated the kind of manipulative charisma that had convinced their parents she was the daughter worth keeping. "Claire," she said, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "You saved my life." "I saved a patient's life," Claire corrected, opening the manila folder. "The fact that the patient happened to share my DNA is irrelevant." She spread the financial documents across the bedside table with the methodical precision of a pathologist laying out evidence. Bank statements, Medicare forms, Social Security records, 5 years of systematic theft documented in black and white. Samantha's eyes flicked over the papers, and Claire saw the exact moment when her sister realized how thoroughly she'd been caught. But instead of shame or remorse, what crossed Samantha's face was calculation, the look of someone already working out her next move. "Those are private documents," Samantha said. "You had no right to." "I had every right," Claire interrupted, pulling a power of attorney form from the stack. "Especially when you've been using forged signatures to steal from our parents' Medicare accounts." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the whisper of air through the ventilation system. Claire had imagined this moment for months, the confrontation, the accusations. The moment when all of Samantha's lies would finally collapse under the weight of evidence. But what she felt wasn't satisfaction. It was something colder, more surgical. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about stopping an infection before it spread. "How long have you known?" Samantha asked finally. "About the Medicare fraud?" "About 6 months. About the Social Security theft?" "About 3. About the fact that you've been systematically draining their accounts while convincing them I'm the criminal?" Claire's voice was steady, clinical. "Since yesterday." Samantha tried to reach for the call button, but Claire's hand was already there, covering it with the same steady pressure she used to control bleeding during surgery. "For once," Claire said quietly, "the paperwork protects me instead of erasing me." She pulled out her phone and showed Samantha the recording app, already running. "Connecticut is a one-party consent state. Anything you say right now is admissible in court. So I'd be very careful about what lies you decide to tell next." The heart monitor began beeping faster as Samantha's pulse increased. Good, Claire thought. Fear was appropriate here. Fear was the only honest emotion Samantha had shown in years. "They threw me away," Claire continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. "Their own daughter. They chose to believe that I was a drug-addicted thief. Rather than ask a single question about why the daughter who had never stolen a penny suddenly turned into a criminal. Do you know what that does to a person, Samantha?" "Claire, It teaches them that blood means nothing. That family is just another word for the people who have the power to destroy you most completely." Claire leaned forward, her eyes locked on her sister's. "But it also teaches them to be very, very careful about documentation." She pulled out the last document, a letter from the Hartford Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Already investigating suspicious activity in Robert and Eleanor's accounts based on an anonymous tip submitted with supporting evidence. "I saved your liver, Samantha," Claire said, standing up and gathering the papers. "I performed 3 hours of surgery to repair the damage from your accident. My success rate is 96%, and you're going to be part of that statistic." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "But now I'm going to let the law dissect your life the same way you dissected mine. The only difference is, they'll use actual evidence instead of lies." The heart monitor was beeping rapidly now, reflecting Samantha's panic. But Claire felt nothing but the cool satisfaction of a surgeon who had successfully removed a tumor. Some operations were about saving lives. Others were about stopping the spread of disease. As she walked down the ICU corridor, Claire could hear Samantha calling for a nurse, her voice high and desperate. But the sound faded quickly, absorbed by the institutional carpet and the white noise of healing machines. For the first time in 5 years, Claire Miller felt like she was finally going home. Friends, how are you feeling about Claire's story so far? I can only imagine what's going through your mind right now watching this brilliant surgeon discover that her own family had been living a lie for 5 years. We've seen Claire go from that sterile hospital corridor, trying to wash away her painful past, to standing face to face with the sister who destroyed her life. And the parents who chose to believe the worst about her. That moment in the ICU, when Claire finally held all the evidence of Samantha's theft, I felt that cold satisfaction right along with her. But here's what strikes me most about this story: sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of causing the deepest wounds. Claire spent years believing she was the problem, that somehow she had earned her family's rejection. But the truth was, she was just the inconvenient witness to someone else's crimes. What's coming next will test everything Claire has built for herself. She's about to learn that having evidence is one thing, but getting justice, real justice, requires courage she didn't know she had. Stay with me, because Claire's story is far from over. The hospital boardroom was designed to intimidate. Mahogany table that could seat 20 oil paintings of former chief administrators staring down with eyes that had seen every kind of human failing. And windows that offered a commanding view of Hartford's modest skyline. Claire had been in this room dozens of times for budget meetings and policy discussions, but never as anything other than chief of trauma surgery. Today, she was something else entirely. Detective Maria Santos from Hartford PD's Financial Crimes Unit had arrived 30 minutes early. Carrying a briefcase that contained 5 years of meticulously documented evidence. Martha Miller, Claire's aunt and the family archivist, sat beside the detective with a banker's box full of additional records, credit card statements, bank account information, and Medicare correspondence that painted a devastating picture of systematic elder abuse. Robert and Eleanor Miller sat at the far end of the table, looking smaller and more fragile than Claire had ever seen them. Robert's Hartford Community College windbreaker had been replaced by a suit that hung loose on his diminished frame, suggesting weight loss brought on by stress and the dawning realization that their finances were in ruins. Eleanor clutched a tissue box and the same Medicare cardholder that had started this whole investigation. Hospital Administrator Drive. Patricia Vance presided over the meeting with the grim efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises. The hospital's legal counsel, James Morrison, sat at her right hand, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Before we begin, Drive," Vance said, "I want to be clear about why we're here. The Hartford Police Department has requested access to our medical records as part of an ongoing investigation into financial crimes. Dr. Claire Miller has agreed to provide testimony regarding her medical treatment of the suspected perpetrator." Claire felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but her voice was steady when she spoke. 3 days ago, I performed emergency surgery on Samantha Miller to repair internal injuries sustained in a motor vehicle accident. During the course of her treatment, I became aware of irregularities in her parents' Medicare documentation that suggested potential fraud. Detective Santos opened her briefcase and began distributing copies of bank statements, each page marked with yellow highlighter and annotated with dates and transaction amounts. Over the past 5 years, Samantha Miller has systematically stolen $63,847.52 from her parents' Medicare accounts, Social Security benefits, and personal savings. She accomplished this through forged power of attorney documents, altered insurance forms, and unauthorized electronic transfers. Eleanor's tissue box hit the floor, scattering white squares across the polished linoleum. The sound was sharp in the quiet room, like something breaking that could never be repaired. Robert stared at the bank statements spread across the table, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of hollow resignation. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Samantha said Claire was the one. She said I was stealing from you to buy drugs," Claire finished. "She convinced you that your youngest daughter was a criminal while she was systematically draining your accounts to pay her own debts." Martha Miller leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades organizing family records. "I've been documenting Samantha's lies for 3 years. Every time she told you Claire was in rehab, Samantha was actually forging your Medicare paperwork. Every time she said Claire was too unstable to contact, Samantha was transferring money from your savings account to hers. Detective Santos placed a final document on the table, a restraining order signed by Judge Patricia Walsh. Based on the evidence collected, Samantha Miller is prohibited from accessing her parents' financial accounts or Medicare information. She's also facing charges of elder abuse, Medicare fraud, and identity theft. The silence that followed was deafening. Through the boardroom windows, Claire could see the Hartford skyline, the same view she'd grown up looking at from her childhood bedroom, back when this city represented safety and home instead of betrayal and exile. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice cracking like old paper. "Where is she now?" "Discharged this morning into police custody, Drive," Vance said gently. "She's been transported to Hartford Correctional Center pending arraignment." Robert's hands shook as he picked up one of the bank statements, squinting at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language. $60,000, he said. "That was supposed to be for prescriptions, for the mortgage, for your retirement," Claire said quietly. "For the life you worked 40 years to earn." He looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time since she'd walked into the trauma bay 3 days earlier. "You're really a doctor," he said, and it wasn't a question anymore. "Chief of Trauma Surgery, Drive," Vance confirmed. "Dr. Miller has saved over 300 lives in the past 2 years. Her success rate is among the highest in the state." Eleanor was crying now, ugly tears that came from somewhere deep and irreparable. "We threw you away," she whispered. "Our own daughter. We believed her instead of you, and we threw you away." Claire felt something crack in her chest, not quite forgiveness. Not quite reconciliation, but maybe the beginning of something that might eventually resemble peace. "You were victims too," she said. "Samantha is very good at making people believe what she needs them to believe." Detective Santos was gathering her papers, preparing to leave them with the wreckage of their family conference. "The district attorney will be in touch about testimony for the trial," she said. "Dr. Miller, thank you for your cooperation." As the detective and hospital administrators filed out of the boardroom, Claire was left alone with the 2 people who had given her life and then taken it away again. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table and the scattered evidence of their family's destruction. "I was your daughter once," Claire said finally. "Now I'm just the person who prevented you from dying in poverty while believing your other daughter was taking care of you." Robert stood up slowly, his age finally showing in the careful way he moved. "Claire," he said, and her name sounded strange in his mouth after 5 years of silence. Is there any way that we can be a family again?" Claire shook her head. "I don't know. But maybe we can figure out how to be people who share the same last name and don't hate each other." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was, Claire realized, the beginning of something that might eventually heal. The truth was a surgery that hurt before it healed, but sometimes the pain was worth it if it meant stopping the infection from spreading. As she walked out of the boardroom, leaving her parents to confront the ruins of their faith in Samantha, Claire felt lighter than she had in years. Not happy, exactly, but clean. Like someone who had finally stopped bleeding and was ready to find out what came next. Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the house on Prospect Street, casting geometric patterns across the hardwood floors that Claire and Nathaniel had spent 3 weekends refinishing by hand. The smell of French toast and fresh coffee filled the air, replacing the institutional scent of hospital disinfectant that had defined Claire's world for so long. Claire stood at the kitchen island, spreading butter across warm bread, while watching her husband set the table with the careful precision of someone who understood that rituals mattered. Nathaniel Cross had been doing this dance for 2 years now, creating the kind of normal, domestic mourning that Claire had forgotten was possible. The kind of mourning that people took for granted until they'd lived without it. "The Hartford Courant wants to interview you," he said, placing cloth napkins beside each plate. "Something about medical professionals who've overcome family estrangement." Claire cracked eggs into a bowl, watching the golden yolks break and blend into something new. "I'm not ready for that conversation yet." The property deed lay on the counter beside the coffee maker, clean white paper that made everything official. 1247 Prospect Street, owned free and clear by Dr. Claire Miller and Nathaniel Cross. Their first house, purchased with money Claire had saved from 5 years of trauma surgery. And the kind of disciplined budgeting that came from having once lived in her car. A knock at the front door interrupted the comfortable quiet. Through the dining room windows, Claire could see a familiar blue sedan parked in their driveway, the same car that used to pick her up for school, that had driven her to piano lessons and soccer practice and all the ordinary moments that had once comprised a childhood. Nathaniel looked at her with raised eyebrows. "You want me to?" "No," Claire said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I've got it." She opened the front door to find Robert and Eleanor Miller standing on her front porch, looking like refugees from their own life. Robert carried a tin of shortbread cookies, the kind Eleanor used to make for church bake sales. Back when their biggest worry was whether the Methodist potluck would have enough desserts. Eleanor held a manila envelope and wore the expression of someone who had spent the last week crying. "We brought these," Robert said, holding up the cookie tin like a peace offering. "Eleanor made them yesterday." They looked older than they had in the hospital boardroom, smaller, more fragile, worn down by the weight of confronting truths they'd spent 5 years avoiding. But there was something else in their faces now, something that hadn't been there during all those years of silence, shame. "Come in," Claire said, stepping aside to let them enter. The kitchen felt smaller with all 4 of them in it, but not uncomfortably so. Claire counted the place settings Nathaniel had arranged: 1, 2, 3, 4. Without discussing it, he began adding plates and coffee cups for their unexpected guests. Eleanor sat down heavily at the kitchen table, placing the manila envelope in front of her like evidence in a trial. "The bank helped us go through everything," she said. "All of Samantha's transactions, the Medicare fraud, the Social Security theft, all of it." She opened the envelope and pulled out a cashier's check. "It's not everything. The bank was able to recover about $40,000 from Samantha's accounts before the arrest. But it's something." Claire looked at the check without touching it. $40,000 more money than she'd seen in one place during those years of working 3 jobs and eating ramen noodles. But somehow, the number felt both huge and completely inadequate at the same time. "Keep it," she said. "You're going to need it for lawyers, for getting your accounts secured, for rebuilding what she took from you." Robert's hands shook as he reached for his coffee cup. "We failed you," he said simply. "We chose to believe the worst about you rather than ask questions about Samantha's stories. We were lazy and stupid and we failed you completely." The words hung in the air between them, honest and terrible, and 5 years too late. Claire felt something shift in her chest, not forgiveness. Exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding that some wounds were too deep for apologies but not too deep for acknowledgement. "You did," she agreed. "You failed me so completely that I stopped believing I deserved better. It took me 3 years of therapy and a man who loves me unconditionally to remember that I'm worth more than the worst thing anyone has ever believed about me." Eleanor was crying again, but quietly this time. "I keep thinking about that last night, when you came home from work and found us packing your things. You asked us to let you explain, and we wouldn't even listen. You said I was dead to you," Claire said, the memory sharp as surgical steel. "You said that until I got clean and made amends, I wasn't welcome in your home." "We were wrong," Robert said. "We were completely, catastrophically wrong, and we don't know how to fix it." Claire poured coffee for everyone, the domestic ritual giving her hands something to do while her mind processed decades of damage. "Maybe you can't fix it," she said finally. "Maybe some things are broken beyond repair. But maybe we can figure out how to build something new from the pieces." She sat down at the table, creating a careful distance between herself and the 2 people who had shaped her childhood and destroyed her young adulthood. "I'm not ready to pretend the last 5 years didn't happen. I'm not ready to act like we're a normal family who just had a little misunderstanding." "We understand," Eleanor said quickly. "But," Claire continued, "I'm tired of carrying all this anger. It's heavy, and I have better things to do with my energy." Nathaniel placed a plate of French toast in the center of the table. And for a moment they all just stared at it, 4 people who shared DNA but had never learned how to share a meal without someone getting hurt. "The coffee is hot," Claire said finally, her voice steady and free of the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. And there's enough French toast for everyone. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't the kind of tearful family reunion that made for satisfying movie endings. But it was something, a beginning, maybe, or at least an agreement to stop bleeding all over each other. Claire looked around the table at these three people who had shaped her life in such different ways. The parents who had broken her heart so thoroughly she'd forgotten it could beat, and the man who had taught her that love was supposed to feel safe instead of dangerous. For the first time in years, when she signed her name in her mind, it felt like it actually belonged to her. Claire Miller, chief of trauma surgery, wife of Nathaniel Cross, daughter of people who had failed her. But were trying to do better, survivor of a family that had imploded and was tentatively, carefully, trying to see if anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. The French toast was getting cold, but nobody seemed to mind. Outside, Hartford was waking up to another ordinary Tuesday. Full of people who were trying to figure out how to be human without hurting each other too much in the process. It was, Claire realized, enough. Friends, how did you find today's story? I have to tell you, Claire's journey hit me right in the heart. Here's a woman who lost everything: her family, her identity, her sense of belonging, because someone she trusted chose lies over truth. For 5 years, she carried the weight of believing she might actually be the person her family said she was: unworthy, untrustworthy, unlovable. But here's what struck me most powerfully about Claire's story: she didn't let their version of her become the truth. When she could have crumbled under the weight of rejection, when she could have given up and decided that maybe they were right about her, she chose instead to become the person she knew she could be. She chose to save lives, to heal people, to build something meaningful from the ashes of her broken heart. That takes a kind of courage that most of us never have to find. The courage to believe in your own worth when the people who are supposed to love you most have decided you're worthless. The courage to keep going when everything familiar has been stripped away. The courage to choose healing over revenge, even when revenge would feel so much better in the moment. We all face moments where we have to choose who we're going to be when other people try to tell us who we are. Maybe it's a family member who sees us as a failure, a boss who underestimates our abilities, or friends who can't see past our mistakes. In those moments, we get to decide: are we going to accept their limited vision of us, or are we going to fight for the truth of who we really are? Claire chose to fight. She chose to become Drive. Claire Miller, the woman who saves lives and builds a future on her own terms. And in the end, the truth protected her in a way that all those years of trying to prove herself never could. That doesn't mean the ending was perfect or easy. Families that break don't always heal cleanly, and trust that's been shattered doesn't magically reassemble itself. But sometimes, healing isn't about going back to what was, it's about creating something entirely new from the pieces that remain. I hope this story brought you a little comfort and something to hold on to. I hope it reminded you that you get to decide who you are, regardless of what anyone else believes about you. And I hope it showed you that sometimes the family that matters most is the one you choose and build for yourself. Your worth isn't determined by how well other people love you. Your value doesn't decrease because someone else couldn't see it. And your story doesn't end just because someone else decided they didn't want to be part of it. If you're carrying the weight of someone else's judgment today, I want you to know their opinion of you is not the truth of who you are. You get to write your own story. You get to sign your own name. You get to decide what kind of person you're going to be when the people who were supposed to believe in you chose not to. Be like Claire. Choose healing. Choose growth. Choose to become the person you know you can be, even if, especially if you have to do it all by yourself. Please subscribe and hit that like button if this story touched your heart. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between someone else's version of you and the truth of who you really are? I'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, friends, keep choosing yourselves. Keep choosing hope. Keep choosing to believe that you are worth more than the worst thing anyone has ever believed about you. Because you are. You absolutely are.